This is Lecture 11, Somatosensation and the Motor System, and this corresponds to Chapter 13, Sections 1 through 6. Just one reminder this week that, as usual, the homework for this week will be due on Sunday by 11 p.m. Recommended readings are relevant to some past chapters that we've covered. So there was an article a while ago in NPR about a baby with 3 genetic parents. That's kind of interesting. In relation to the genetic chapter that we covered. And then if you have a cat, you might find this interesting, that cats are actually susceptible to illusory movement, just like humans. And you can see it on this video. It's kind of funny. And if you have a cat, you can test it out too. So you can print out the illusion and display it to your cat and see if the cat tries to touch the moving snakes.
Okay, starting in Section 1 of Chapter 11, Hierarchy of Movement Control. Quick review of some of the basics. Afferent information is information that's coming from the body to the central nervous system. So this includes somatosensory information from sensory neurons around the body. Afferent information, on the other hand, is information that's moving from the central nervous system to the body, moving out, and that includes motor responses. We've also covered the spinal cord briefly, but just to review, this connects the somatosensory system and the motor system. So this afferent information and efferent information, and that's connected sometimes by interneurons or sometimes sensory neurons synapse directly onto motor neurons. There's the posterior tract, which is sensory information, and that forms the posterior root. The anterior tracts are motor and forms the anterior root, and various segments of vertebrae groups are grouped together into 5 different regions. Each of those regions represents a portion of the skin called the dermatome. As well, different layers of the motor cortex and somatosensory cortex are specialized for different functions. So if you look over here, layer 4 of the cortex is for sensory input. Integration happens in layers 1 through 3, and then efferent information is stored or moves through sections 5 through 6. And notice that in the sensory cortex and motor cortex, the layers are organized in a similar fashion. So the main nervous system components that we're going to talk about in movement are just the basic central nervous system. So the cerebrum and this brainstem, which make up the brain, and then the spinal cord. And even simple movements, even the most basic movements, typically involve communication between several systems and regions of the central nervous system. So we'll start with the cerebrum, which again is like the forebrain, or the higher level part of the brain, what we mostly think of as the brain. The cerebrum creates motor sequences, which are sort of packets of motor programs. So individual movements are sort of packaged together and pre-programmed by the brain as a unit, rather than having each individual thing, like to pick up a cup, you don't want to have to think, you don't want the brain to have to organize every single movement that is required to pick up a cup, and so they're kind of packaged as a group. As one motor sequence is being executed, the next sequence is being prepared, so it's sort of on standby. And motor sequences code for kind of simple actions that we do a lot over and over again, such as picking up a glass, putting on your glasses, sitting down in a chair, picking up a book, something like that. The planning and also the initiation of motor sequences takes place in the frontal lobes. So most of the motor activity, or planning and execution, takes place in the frontal lobe, so forward from the central sulcus. There are 3 main sections of the frontal cortex, and each one has a different function in the motor system. So the frontal cortex is used for a lot of different things, but motor function is one of the main things that happens in the frontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is the top of the hierarchy. That's kind of the newest part of our brain in evolution. And the prefrontal cortex plans behavior, motor behavior, specifies what the goal is. So if you're going to pick up a cup, the goal is pick up the cup, that the cup gets into my hand. Lesions to the prefrontal cortex cause poor decision making, inappropriate behavior. People with prefrontal cortex lesions act sexually inappropriate, and they know that this behavior is incorrect, but they can't seem to make a different decision. So can't seem to inhibit behaviors that they know are not going to bode well for them. The next region, this purple region, is the premotor cortex, and this this receives instructions from the prefrontal cortex and then coordinates the movement between multiple body parts, and lesions predictably cause an inability to coordinate body movements. Finally, there's the primary motor cortex, which integrates this information to produce skilled movements. Lesions to the primary motor cortex cause impaired reaching and grasping movements, impaired talking. The brainstem is also involved in motor activity, so the brainstem is responsible for kind of really basic movement, innate movement that has been part of a species' motor vocabulary for a long time throughout evolution. So the stimulation of a brainstem, for example, in a cat can cause this arching, this back arching that they do when they're angry or scared. Chickens have this specific way that they screech in response to a threat. So survival behaviors are often innate to a species and mediated by the brainstem. And our ability to stimulate the brainstem and get these behaviors, induce these behaviors in animals indicates that the brainstem is in fact involved in complex behaviors. Brainstem kind of has a reputation for being very, very, very basic and really not involved in complex behaviors, but at least in the motor system, this isn't the case. So the brainstem also plays an important role in automatic or relatively automatic and rhythmic movements, such as maintaining posture, walking and swimming. Walking is actually a rather complex motor action that requires rhythm, so it requires the ability to repetitively and smoothly execute motor schemas. Abnormal development of the brainstem can result in cerebral palsy, which is a motor disorder that's characterized by a lack of motor coordination, poor balance, stiff muscles, tremors. People are often in a wheelchair. There are often also issues with sort of the coordination of some higher level cognitive functions that are associated with cerebral palsy, although there are plenty of people with cerebral palsy with normal intelligence or above average intelligence. And if you're interested in cerebral palsy, there's this YouTube comedian named Zach Anner who has cerebral palsy and kind of has a series about his life. He actually makes some workout videos, kind of tongue-in-cheek about his life with cerebral palsy. The spinal cord acts as a relay between the body and the brain, and also has some of its own complex functions. So reflexes are mediated by the spinal cord. For example, the scratch reflex, which is when you scratch a dog's belly and his hind leg starts moving as if he's trying to scratch at the same time. That's actually just a reflex. In people who have spinal cord injuries, depending on where the injury is, how high or low on the spinal cord, it can have different effects. So in somebody with quadriplegia, quad meaning 4, this is a paralysis of all 4 limbs. And this happens due to a higher location of the spinal cord injury. Paraplegia is caused by a lesion or damage slightly lower on the spinal cord, and this is just paralysis of the legs. Section 2, motor system organization. The motor system is very adaptive and versatile in general. The motor cortex in the brain. So when I say motor cortex, I'm typically going to be referring to this primary motor cortex, this strip of cortex right in front of the central sulcus. researchers have mapped out the motor cortex by stimulating patients during neurosurgery. So if someone is getting neurosurgery and their brain is already exposed, a lot of times researchers will take this opportunity to learn a bit more about the brain, and this is in waking surgeries. So the patient is awake, their brain is exposed, and they'll sort of stimulate different areas of the motor cortex and see what body part moves during that time. The motor cortex has a topographical organization, which, if you remember from before, means a spatial organization of the body that's represented in neural or sensory systems. So, for example, in the motor cortex, if you look at this little image on the left here, in the motor cortex, the thumb is near each of the fingers. The fingers are sort of in order on the cortex. This is associated with the hand and the wrist, elbow, for example. So the body is kind of mapped onto the cortex. And this is also called a homunculus, which means like a little man. So there's like sort of a little man mapped out on the motor cortex. The motor cortex kind of has functional movement categories. So for different areas of the motor cortex, there's different categories such as grasping or climbing or bringing food to the mouth that are encoded in different areas. You can consider it sort of like a vocabulary of movements with different vocabulary groups encoded in different areas. And this can be changed by practicing different things, which would increase their representation on the cortex, or learning new things would create new vocabulary in the motor cortex. The neurons in the motor cortex code for behaviors by increasing their firing rate as well as the frequency, the frequency as well as the duration of the firing rate. So if the primary motor cortex gets a command from the prefrontal cortex that it should grasp a mug very strongly, then the neurons would fire more quickly and also would fire for a longer time, which would code to an increased force of movement, increased grasp. Sometimes we might see neurons in the motor cortex firing even when someone is not moving, and this is coding for planning a movement as well as withholding a movement, so kind of wanting to do a movement but not doing it, inhibiting this. There's still sort of the motor plan is still being activated in the cortex, as well as imagining a movement. So there's a famous study where an individual was in a coma, I think, and they were asked to imagine playing tennis. I'm sorry, they probably weren't in a coma, they were maybe just not able to respond. So I think they had Blockman syndrome, where they weren't able to respond, but they were still conscious, and they were put in a scanner and asked to imagine playing tennis. And the parts of the brain in the motor area that are associated with playing tennis started being activated just by them responding, or imagining that they were playing tennis. Motor cortex is plastic. It changes according to learning, and it can change in response to injury. So if one area is injured, other areas can compensate for the function that was affected by that injury. So, for example, if an area that is dedicated to the elbow and shoulder movement is lesioned or cut, then part of the neighboring area can become designated to these functions instead. This only happens if the damaged function is practiced. So the individual who has a damage to the elbow and shoulder part of the brain has to practice moving their elbow and shoulder in order for other parts of the cortex to compensate for those movements and gradually regain functioning. And this is called constraint-induced therapy, which is kind of a forced use of the damaged function in order to regain that function. So motor plans that come from the cortex move down through the spine, through these corticospinal tracts, and these are axons that originate mostly in the motor cortex, extend down through the brainstem. Some of these tracts remain ipsilateral, so on the same side. So if they started in the right hemisphere, they would remain on the right side of the brainstem and the spinal tract. Though a couple tracts run contralateral, so to the other side. Contralateral tracts are responsible for contralateral limbs, arms and legs, as well as digits, fingers and toes. Anterior corticospinal tracts move ipsilateral midline muscles, so kind of the core body muscles. And so there are 2 tracts per side that are extending down from the spinal cord, 2 tracts from the right hemisphere, 2 tracts from the left hemisphere, and these synapse with both interneurons in the spinal cord as well as motor neurons. The anterior horn of the spinal cord is topographically organized, so there's kind of a little, sort of like a little homunculus in there too. If you look at the image, you can see that within the anterior horn of the spinal cord, there's the area that's responsible for the fingers, right next to the arm area, which is right by the shoulder area, and then the trunk, or the kind of inside the shoulder. And important to remember that motor neurons are the final pathway for all motor commands. So everything that originates in that prefrontal cortex comes all the way through this system down to motor neurons, which are the final part of the nervous system to execute the motor commands. Motor neurons and the interneurons work together to control both extensor and flexor muscles in the body. So extensor and flexor muscles are sets of muscles that work in opposition to each other. An example would be biceps, which is a flexor muscle, and triceps, which is an extensor muscle. So triceps are in the back of the arm, biceps are in the front of the arm. When you flex your arm, you show your biceps. When you extend your arm, that's using your triceps. And acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter in the body that's acting to connect motor neurons to muscles. So motor neurons are causing the release of acetylcholine into the muscles. Moving on to section 3, basal ganglia, cerebellum, and movement. Basal ganglia and cerebellum are 2 non-cortical structures that are most prominently implicated in the motor system. So the basal ganglia sort of modulates motor activity. It doesn't create the plans for motor activity, but it adjusts them. So it plays a role in habit learning, in motivation. There's also, basal ganglia has some emotional roles. The basal ganglia is the name for a couple structures. It's the caudate nucleus, as well as a structure called the striatum. The striatum is composed of the putamen and the globus pallidus, and these are all ganglia in that subcortical region, in that inside part of the brain. The 3 main connections of the basal ganglia are the cortex. So actually most regions of the cortex send information to the basal ganglia. So there's incoming information from the cortex. The basal ganglia in turn sends information to the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex. And then there's a 2-way information transfer between dopaminergic nigrostriatal pathway and the basal ganglia, and this includes the substantia nigra, which, if you remember, is a part of the brain that has a lot of dopamine cells. It's actually black with dopamine cells, that's why it's called nigra. One way in which the basal ganglia can be conceptualized in terms of its role in motor activity is that it's sort of a volume control. So it determines how much force is needed in a movement, how strong the movement should be. Lesions to the striatum specifically increase involuntary movements. So for example, the striatum is damaged in Huntington's disease, and if you remember, Huntington's is characterized by this fluid involuntary movement called Huntington's chorea, or like Huntington's dance. As well, Tourette syndrome is associated with damage to the striatum. Tourette syndrome is this neurological and also somewhat psychological disorder where people perform involuntary motor activities. So this could be like a tic, like their face might move, their mouth might move. There's also vocal tics or verbal tics where somebody might shout a word out involuntarily in Tourette syndrome. In contrast, loss of dopamine cells in the nigrostriatal pathway that projects to the basal ganglia can produce difficulty in initiating movements. So this could be stiffness or trouble initiating an intentional movement. Parkinson's disease is associated with damage to this pathway. If you remember, Parkinson's is associated with difficulty in moving, especially voluntary movement, and kind of a rigidity, and what they call like cog-like behaviors, where movements are very shaky and non-fluid. Moving on to the cerebellum. If you remember from previous sections, the cerebellum is this small structure in the back of the brain below the visual cortex. Cerebellum means little brain because it looks kind of like a little brain stuck up under there. And their cerebellum is predominantly responsible for acquiring and maintaining skilled motor abilities. Different parts of the cerebellum are specialized. Don't worry too much about the different areas of the cerebellum. Just know that it has topographical organization, so it again has this like homunculus organization where the face is near, or different parts of the face are coated near each other. The limbs and the digits are close to each other, so there's like a little map of a person in the cerebellum as well. One of the main functions of the cerebellum is control over the timing and coordination of movement. So the coordination of movements and correct timing is actually extremely important and rather complex. Our hands have to work in concert with each other. Our fingers have to work together, and even small issues with timing can cause major problems with fluid and coordinated movement. The cerebellum is also part of a system that's responsible for comparing the motor plan from the motor cortex against sensory feedback that comes in from our motor behavior. So for example, if I take off my shoe and I feel the removal of that shoe stimulus from my foot, that's expected. I expect that to happen because the motor plan has been sent to other areas of my brain telling it, expect sensory feedback, you're about to take your shoe off. And so this doesn't come as a surprise to me. So going along with what I was just saying, our brain responds less strongly to the sensory feedback of things that we caused as opposed to the sensory feedback of things that other people caused. An example of this is that most people cannot tickle themselves because the tickle sensation comes from surprise, and we can't surprise ourselves with tickling because the brain expects it. We created the motor plan to tickle, and so our brain already expects it, and we don't get that surprise sensation. In schizophrenia, the cerebellum is one of the parts of the brain that's affected, and this comparator mechanism comparing the motor plan against the sensory feedback is dysfunctional. As a result, many people with schizophrenia, especially people who are actively symptomatic, can actually tickle themselves. They can surprise themselves because this comparator is broken, or at least dysfunctional. And as this comparison is associated with a sense of agency, or a feeling of having intentionally completed a motor activity, this dysfunctional comparator mechanism has been implicated as a possible reason that people in schizophrenia have delusions of being controlled by outside forces. So sometimes people with schizophrenia, a rather common delusion will be that the CIA has taken over their body and is causing them to do things, that an alien has control over their hands and that they're not the ones controlling their body. So this cerebellar dysfunction might be the reason for some of those delusions. Moving on to section 4, somatosensory receptors and pathways. Somatosensation is all of the sensory receptors in the skin, muscles, joints, tendons, and internal organs. It's somato means like body, so it's essentially the sensations of the body. This includes the vestibular system, which is in the inner ear and is responsible for detecting balance and head movements. Somatosensory system, as we talked about briefly at the beginning of this chapter, is an afferent system. Info flows inward toward the central nervous system, whereas the motor system is efferent. Information flows out of the central nervous system toward the body. Somatosensory receptors are distributed all over the body and includes two main groups of skin, types of skin. That's hairy skin, which is just as it sounds, skin that has hair on it, or that has hair on some people. People have different amounts of hair on their body. So hairy skin is any skin that body hair can be attached to, has hair follicles, and this is most of the skin on our body. And then there's glabrous skin, which has no hair. There are more sensory receptors on glabrous skin as compared to hairy skin. There are no hair follicles on glabrous skin. And this is areas such as the palm of your hand, the palm of your, or the bottom of your feet, your lips, and your tongue. These are areas that we have better sensory reception in. So if you step on something in the palm of your foot, that hurts a lot more than if you sit on something and it hits the side of your leg. There are a number of ways to study the sensitivity of the skin, but one very simple way is with a 2-point discrimination task or a 2-point sensitivity test. And in this, you just use something that looks kind of like a protractor, like you might have used in grade school, and calculate the smallest distance at which a person can determine, based on the sense of touch, that 1 point is being applied to their skin as opposed to 2 points. So this is the 2-point discrimination. So the smaller the distance between the 2 points that you can distinguish as being different from 1 point, the higher sensitivity that part of your skin has. There are approximately 20 different types of sensory receptors, somatosensory receptors in the human body, but they fall into 3 main functional groups. There's irritation or nociception, so that includes pain, temperature, and itch. And there's pressure or fine touch, which is also known as hapsis. And then there's proprioception, which is movement and body awareness. And don't worry about learning all these different types within those categories, just know that there are a range of types within those categories. There are also different durations of receptor responses. So sensory receptors are going to tell you 2 main things about the timing of a sensory event: when it happened and how long it happened. The first type of sensory receptor is the rapidly adapting receptor, which responds to the onset of sensory stimulation, such as putting on a watch. And then the slowly adapting receptor is going to respond for the entire time that the sensory stimulus is occurring. So when you leave that watch on for an hour, it's going to be, the sensory receptor is going to be continuously telling your brain that it's there. Posterior root ganglion neurons carry somatosensory information to the central nervous system. The axons enter the spinal cord. The cell bodies are kind of grouped all together in this little bulge you see in the yellow before the axons are entering the spinal cord. And these ganglion, or like group of axons, are composed of many different types of somatosensory neurons, so it's not all just one kind. A loss of function, so a lesion to the posterior root ganglion neurons, can result in significantly reduced ability to control and perceive different parts of the body, so that can be a really dramatic loss. For instance, somebody can lose the ability to continuously hold something in their hand because they're not getting that sensory feedback from their hand so that they can adjust their grip on the object in their hand. The motor system remains intact, but without sensory feedback, the appropriate motor force cannot be implemented. there's a section in your book at this point about 2 different pathways in the brain. Don't worry about it. Don't read it, absolutely, if it's interesting to you, but I don't want you to worry too much about it because it is a little bit complex, and there's a lot of material in these chapters. So moving on to spinal reflexes. Somatosensory nerve fibers send projections to both the brain and to interneurons and motor neurons in the brainstem and spinal cord. And those interneurons and motor neurons in the spinal cord mediate spinal reflexes. So there are different types of spinal reflexes. The first is a monosynaptic reflex, in which there's a single synapse between the motor neuron and the somatosensory neuron. And this makes it quicker. There's no interneuron to kind of mediate the response. So the example would be if you ever go to the doctor and she hits you on the knee with the little hammer and your foot swings up, this is a monosynaptic reflex. Other more complex reflexes, such as controlling walking or your standing posture, involve interneuron connections. They have a few more inputs that mediate those reflexes. Okay, pain. Pain is, we would typically consider it to be a bad thing, but it's actually necessary to survival. It tells us when we're in danger, when we're injured. If you're interested, there's a range of videos on YouTube about people who are born without pain receptors, typically because of a developmental issue, and the struggles that they have without when their body is not able to tell them when they're in danger or when they're injured. Pain perception is actually extremely complex. It comes from a combination of sensory inputs. There are maybe around 8 types of pain fibers, up to 4 possible pathways of pain information going to the central nervous system. And this is one main reason that it can be really hard to treat chronic pain. Chronic pain, for both doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists, it can be really challenging to have a chronic pain patient because the medications we have are not sufficient, and you get addicted to them, you get used to them. So really can be very challenging to bring any relief to somebody who suffers from chronic pain. As well, there are many factors that can influence the perception of pain, and this includes expectation, so whether you expect something to be painful or not. When you go to the doctor, sometimes they might surprise you with a shot, or with kids, they kind of might not tell them that they're about to give them a shot, and this is one way to reduce the expectation that something is going to be painful. Baseline levels of emotional arousal. If somebody's extremely upset, pain can seem worse than if they're feeling calm or feeling happy, and as well the context of a painful stimulus. One example of a factor that can influence or have an expectation effect on pain is the placebo effect of pain relief, which is you can give someone sugar pills and tell them it will relieve their headache, and typically it will have at least some, it will give them at least some relief, just that expectation that the pill they took should relieve their headache. One of the prominent theories of pain, which is a little bit controversial, there's many different theories, and there are strengths and weaknesses to any theory, but one of the main theories is the gate theory of pain. And in this theory, these 2 fibers, the haptic proprioceptive fiber and the nociceptive fiber, synapse on the same interneuron, so the interneuron kind of mediates the connection between these 2 fibers. The haptic proprioceptive fiber, when activated, can inhibit pain information through the interneuron, so it can inhibit the nociceptive fiber from getting to the brain or from sending information to the brain. An example of this is if you stub your toe or hit your knee and rub it, this can often make the pain, it can inhibit some of the pain, and this would be a manual activation of the haptic proprioceptive fiber. Referred pain is a pain that's caused by internal organs but felt on the surface of the body. A really common example of this is that predominantly in men, heart attack is often felt as shoulder pain. So the pain is actually happening in the heart muscles, but it's referred pain, so people sometimes feel it in their shoulders or in their left arm. There's also phantom limb pain. So individuals who have an amputated limb will often feel sensations in that missing limb. So if someone loses their left arm, they might still feel like their left hand is connected somehow or is present. The central nervous system is still perceiving the limb as present. There's still a part of the central nervous system that codes for the left arm. The sensations may be due to reorganization of the somatosensory cortex. It might also just be random firings. Your book mentions some treatments, and my perception of the treatments is that they, based on the research, they actually tend to have rather low efficacy, but they include things like vibration therapy, antidepressant therapy, stimulation of the spinal cord associated with that limb, and then this mirror box where the existing arm is put next to a mirror so that it looks like this person has two arms, and in some patients that's provided relief. If you're interested, you can see this video on phantom pains. Moving on to the vestibular system. This is the system in your inner ear that's responsible for balance. It is comprised of receptors in the inner ear that detect your body position as well as your head position. So there are two groups of receptors that do this, and they're kind of right there on the cochlea, if you remember from the auditory chapter. There's the first group is the semicircular canals, these little loops, and they're filled with fluid. The movement of the fluid, that when your head moves or your body moves, the fluid moves, and this stimulates the cilia of the hair cells and creates a response. The loops are oriented in the three-dimensional planes so that movement in any dimension will have some kind of response, will be coded in the brain. And then there's the otolith organs, which contain actually a gelatinous substance as well as a type of salt crystal. And the movement of this stimulates the cilia of hair cells as well, and also gives information about body position, head position. You might be familiar with vertigo, which is the experience of spinning or the world moving when one is sitting still. And this is associated with a number of different disorders, but when it's pathological, so some people have chronic vertigo, this is caused by dysfunction in the vestibular system in this inner ear. Okay, moving on to section 5, the somatosensory cortex. There are two main parts of the somatosensory cortex, which are both in the parietal lobe. There's the primary somatosensory cortex, also known as S1, and this receives sensory information from the body that's gone through the thalamus, coming up from the body, this afferent information. The secondary somatosensory cortex, or S2, gets information from S1 and has more refined processing of that information, and then it sends information to different areas of the brain, including the frontal cortex. S1 is organized, as many things have been that we've talked about, in this topographical or homunculus manner. So just like the primary motor cortex, if you look at this image on the bottom left, the somatosensory cortex and the motor cortex, which are right next to each other, code for the same parts of the body. The somatosensory cortex, however, represents, actually has four little strips that code for somatosensory information from different parts of the body. So the muscles, two for the skin, for the slow and fast receptors, and then another one for joint and pressure. And remember that the somatosensory cortex, like the motor cortex, represents the opposite, the contralateral side of the body. Damage to S1 can cause complete and permanent deficits in all sensory functions. So S1 is incredibly important to somatosensory function and sensory function. Impairments in motor functions can happen as well when there's damage to S1 because of this intimate interplay between the somatosensory system and the motor system. The motor system is reliant on somatosensory inputs. However, the somatosensory cortex is plastic, just like the motor cortex. In this monkey experiment that was described in your book, researchers cut the ganglion cells for one arm, which created deafferentation of that arm, meaning there was no sensory input coming to the cortex from that arm. After several years, the area of S1 that was previously allocated to the arm was now represented the face. So it was a demonstration that the plasticity of the cortex no longer was needed for the arm, so the face took over, and there's a larger part of the somatosensory cortex that codes for the face. Interestingly, we can't ask monkeys about this, but in humans who have had arm amputation, the stimulation of facial skin can sometimes feel like a stimulation of the missing arm, indicating that something similar might be happening as what happened in the monkey brain. And this is called phantom touch, when stimulation of one part of the body creates an illusory stimulation of another part of the body. The somatosensory cortex is also involved in higher level of movement. So if you remember the dorsal stream, which was the how stream, and the ventral stream, which is the what stream, these were two visual streams that we talked about in the visual section. The dorsal stream goes to the parietal lobe, ventral stream goes to the temporal lobe. So information from S1 and S2 are contributed to these two streams as well. Damage to S2, to the secondary somatosensory cortex, can cause what's called motor apraxia, and there's many different types of motor apraxia, but it in general is a disruption in the execution and sequencing of different types of movements. So you can see a video, if you like, of somebody with ideomotor apraxia, which is an inability to imagine movements, to motor imagery, to sort of mimic movements. And then a picture here, you can see somebody with motor apraxia is trying to comb their hair, and they can kind of do like the rough movements, but they don't have that sensory feedback, so they're not able to, the comb is flipped over, they're not able to do everything correctly.